Good morning, everybody. I'm Jim Jeffrey, the chair of the Wilson Middle East program. Here at the MEP, we put particular pride into our Middle East, North Africa development and social programs for the Arab world. And today, in the spirit of that particular focus that we have, we're going to do a presentation on education in the Arab world and its impact on the social economy of the region. I don't want to get ahead of the wonderful experts we have, the authors, just to note that the Arab world has seen a very rapid expansion of education in terms of numbers. What we haven't seen is the same impact on the workforce, on the economy, and that's what we're going to look into in more detail today. This will be moderated by the director of the program, Marisa Horma. Marisa, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Jeffrey, and welcome to MEP's panel discussion of a newly released book, The Political Economy of Education in the Arab World. This is truly an excellent volume, and as the editors noted in the introduction, many reports and many studies have already been published about the lacking quality of education in the region, its impact on the workforce, primarily its impact on youth and women, the former being the vast majority in the region and the latter representing half of the population. We here at the Wilson Center's Middle East program, under the umbrella of the MENA Workforce Development Initiative, have also examined why the education sector is underperforming, or why is it failing to produce skilled labor for what the markets need. We've published a report earlier in 2019 entitled Ready for Work, Assessing the Asymmetries in the Workforce. So we've examined this link with the workforce. However, what we have not looked at is the link of education to democracy, or the lack thereof. And we didn't really delve deeper as to why some of these educational reforms that have been rolled out, not in its entirety, but we've seen some reforms in different waves across the region. Why haven't they made an impact? Why aren't we seeing changes in education outcomes? And that is why this book is very important. It's a unique addition to the plethora of literature on education in the Arab world. As a woman born and raised in the region in Jordan, many of the anecdotal evidence and the analysis provided sort of hit home for me, because I do remember in elementary and middle school in particular, history books that were very sort of thin on hefty political discussions or historical discussions. We were expected to memorize certain dates and the developments that were associated with these dates, but there was only one narrative that was presented. And I was one of the privileged ones that was able to go to private school and then shift to more international diplomas that allowed me to compete here in North America. But that's certainly not the case for the majority of the people in the region. So I think this book is truly an important addition. We're very delighted to be hosting the editors and authors of this volume to present this book and have a discussion with all of you. So we're going to start. I'm going to introduce our speakers and editors and authors. Hicham Alaoui, Research Associate at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. Robert Springborg, Research Fellow at the Italian Institute of International Affairs in Rome, and also Adjunct Professor at the Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. Ishaq Diwan, Professor of Economics at Paris Sciences et Lettres, and a former Wilson Fellow and dear colleague of ours, Lindsay Benstead, who's also Associate Professor at the Mark Hatfield School of Government and Director of the Middle East Studies Center at Portland University. And to comment on the book is an expert on education, and I believe that Safa will be commenting on the book for the first time. Safa El Kogali, Manager for East and Southern Affairs Southern Africa in Education and Global Practice at the World Bank. So thank you all for bringing this book discussion to the Wilson Center. Before we delve into this, just a reminder to the audience to submit questions on Twitter to @WilsonCenterMEP or by email to mep@wilsoncenter.org. So Hicham, I'm going to start with you as a co-editor of this volume and ask you to give us a synopsis about the genesis of this project. Why is it important to address this dimension, the political economy of education in the Arab world? And how do you see this volume contributing to the debate about what next in the region when it comes to the educational sector?
Well, thank you very much, Marissa. Thank you to the Wilson Center for hosting us. Thank you to all the organizers, and thank you to this panel. And finally, thank you to all the attendees. Just as a caveat or as a disclaimer, I'm not an expert on education. I'm an expert on democratization and actually transitions from authoritarian rule, and actually lately more focusing on transitions from democracy to authoritarian rule, because the two are linked. And let me just say a word about this, the genesis of this project. It came from a particular contradiction that we all notice. We see the landscape as we examine the landscape of education in MENA. Governments everywhere champion the cause of educating the populations, and they expend considerable resources per GDP in percentage. For instance, for decades, Gulf monarchies have poured vast funds into every level of education. They have built new schools, new universities, hired teachers, and created research institutions from scratch. More populous countries have likewise never wavered in their efforts regarding education. For generations, they have urged their citizens to attend schools and earn university degrees to maintain their social fabric. Yet everywhere, the results of national educational systems have been, at best, underwhelming. For instance, in my country of Morocco, there have been massive campaigns and real efforts over the past 20 years to revamp the national education system at all levels. It is permanently on the official agenda, and it's pervasive in discourse everywhere in civil society and in society at large. However, here too, the results have been rather disappointing. Beyond achieving basic literacy, which shouldn't be, by the way, the standard, the quality of Arab education, or the only standard, the quality of Arab education everywhere has lagged behind in many ways. Many universities are credential factories that basically produce people that cannot integrate into the market. Arab students score poorly on international tests wherever there are such indexes, and gender gaps are persistent. Above all, the youth produced by schooling feel so disillusioned and feel so much divorced from the realities and as far as the requirements of their preparation that they feel like emigrating, and those that stay protest. How do we explain this crisis? This is why we embarked upon this project. I mean, it was an organic step from the prevalence or the old studies that centered around pedagogy and infrastructure, but it was not the organic and natural. It wasn't necessarily compelling. The problem is not necessarily a lack of resources or even expertise. For decades, the international community has injected significant development funding and educational assistance to upgrade these education systems, but with little results. As Bob and I began exploring this topic and discussing it, the true political contours of the subject became slowly apparent to us. I think, in all modesty, our intervention is rather unique, or let's say novel. We seek to reframe the terms of the debate. Education is not merely a social issue. Well, it is a social issue. It is an indirect political issue, but it is an eminently political one as well. Substandard schooling is part of what we call a limited access order, or political systems where access to precious resources like knowledge is curtailed for vast segments of the society. We think of educational success, we invoke the most humanistic elements of emancipation. Schooling is supposed to provide the tools needed for critical thinking and self-empowerment. It is an inherent part of having an active, engaged citizenry that debates political issues and questions authority in productive ways. But this sort of education, as Marissa just said, poses an existential threat to limited access orders, or what we commonly call autocratic systems. For many Arab societies, education is the pillar of society. It is important because society rests on it. But for many of these governments, it is not only the pillar of society, but it's also the pillar of the state, of political control. Across the region, governments long treated schooling as an instrument not to create an enlightened citizenry, but impose ideology upon them. And it emphasized rote memorization and imparted hollow symbols of national identity. That is, by articulating a kind of civic culture that feeds into the national narrative, and it's usually a unique and official national narrative. We continue to see this tendency now, even in countries that have imported branches of Western universities. Governments crave the ultimate outcome of advanced education, such as research, achievements, and technical proficiencies, but without allowing for critical spirit of liberal arts necessary to prove or to produce these outcomes. Again, at a certain level, it seems to me as if they are unaware of this trade-off. They want education badly, and they want this to start paying dividends, but they are not so much clear about the sacrifices that this entails. Very briefly, we see the fundamental problem as not so much physical infrastructure or even educational pedagogy, meaning the transmission of knowledge. Rather, the problem lies in the philosophy, and hence, what kind of knowledge is being transferred? What kind of knowledge is being inculcated to pupils and to students at every level? Limited access orders see critical thinking as threatening. It is dangerous because educational emancipation allows subjects to become citizens and interrogate the social contracts they live under. There is good reason why so many power holders in the Arab world fear this outcome. The Arab Spring stands as an enduring testament to the fact that when political consciousness of young Arabs is awakened, the ground beneath societies start to shake. This is why many educational systems remained engaged inside the political economy that frowns on fundamental change. Governments can accept and in fact welcome development assistance from multilateral donors in the cause of education. They can regurgitate and repeat the vocabulary of education reform and speak about entrepreneurship. However, at an essential level, they cannot reframe the blueprint of what education represents to their political order. This points to an almost unsurmountable tension. On the one hand, governments need the highly skilled, productive citizenry to further advance development. And they call it very loudly, they profoundly want it. Yet on the other hand, this politically undermines their own power, and they don't know quite how to commit to this trade-off. Ultimately, this is why we argue that true reform within Arab education cannot occur unless all other political institutions that support it also align to this imperative. Last sentence, this book is not a manual on how to solve the Arab educational crisis. This is a very complex problem, but rather it tries to give a glimpse and a plea for us to think more reflectively how to think beyond these classical systemic and infrastructure and pedagogic constraints. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hicham. I think this was a great introduction into how this book contributes to the literature. And I do agree, it is definitely a unique sort of window into a new dimension of educational reform and the education sector in particular. Robert, I'm going to turn to you as the co-editor of the book, but also an author. You contributed a chapter on Egypt and education reform under Sisi in particular. But perhaps a little bit before we get into Egypt, and you're more than welcome to zoom into Egypt as an example. Hicham mentioned, and we also know that there's tons of development assistance that has been pouring into the region with a list of reforms that are needed, primarily focused on how to best prepare students for the workforce. And that entailed a long list of educational reforms. And there have been reforms that have been enacted. So why is it that we haven't seen the outcomes needed? Were these reforms perhaps too technical and looked at sort of a very narrow, or looked at the challenges in a very narrow way? And how does this play out in Egypt, where given its large population, it's over 100 million now, has the largest education system and an increasingly authoritarian regime under Sisi, who perhaps has also sort of pursued an education policy of its own. So perhaps you can just walk us through those two elements in your presentation. I think you're on mute.
Unmute myself. Thank you for your introduction and these challenging questions. I'll defer them for a moment and thank you and Ambassador Jeffrey for hosting us today. And I especially also want to thank Safa Al-Kigali for joining us, as she is the principal author of the most recent very thorough World Bank study of education, the second following after Ahmed Galal's of more than 15 years ago on The Road Not Taken. So we have with us indeed one of the world's experts on this subject, and we are very keen to hear her reactions to the book. And I would also like to thank Mulay Hicham, not only for his very useful introduction, but for the idea for this book, as well as the support that made it possible. And when it came to myself and Lindsay and a couple of others to sort of sound us out, I'm not sure if they were quite as skeptical as I was, but I was quite skeptical for the reasons that you have just summarized, namely that this subject of Arab education and its underperformance has received a huge amount of attention. And so we sort of scratched our heads collectively. And another of our panelists here, in my lower left-hand side in my screen, Ishak Dewan, was one of the, although he didn't know it at the time, was one of those who helped provide the answer to us. And it was as a result of his parallel work on the obstacles to economic development globally, but most specifically in the Middle East and North Africa. And as Mulay just explained, the key obstacle Ishak and his colleagues identified to economic growth was the nature of the political economic regimes. And Ishak and others borrowed from Douglas North, an institutional economist, this concept of limited access orders. And so the lights began to shine. If Ishak and his colleagues could convincingly demonstrate that this sort of a political economy had very negative effects on growth rates, why wouldn't it also have a negative effect on performance in service sectors, education and health? And so it was really that insight that enabled us to then explore how limited access orders might operate in specific countries in the Middle East and North Africa. So the book that's the sort of structure of the book, trying to parallel the work that Ishak and his colleagues at the bank did on using a tighter framework, I must say, in their case, by using the idea of politically connected firms and the consequences of that political connectedness on the overall performance of the macroeconomy. Now, this book cannot be as tight and as thorough and as empirically based as the various studies that have been done by the bank and by Ishak independently. This book is an intent to sort of introduce the idea and to stimulate scholars now to begin to clarify what the independent variables within that limited access order are and how they impact on the dependent variables of educational performance. And so I will just give you an idea very quickly now, Marissa, without directly answering your question, of the chapters in the book. And the book commences with one by Ishak himself, which is an attempt to explain the dependent variables of underperformance in terms of social and democratic attitudes produced by education in the Middle East and North Africa, and an investigation of what the causes of that might be. That book is followed, that chapter rather, is followed by one by Roland Meyer, in which he does a content analysis of civics textbooks in 3 countries, not Jordan, Marissa, but in Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco, to determine exactly how civics are taught. And not surprising, given your comments and what our general knowledge is, civics are taught from the point of view of trying to reinforce patriotism and loyalty to specific regimes. Florian Kostal, in a book comparing educational reforms in Morocco and Egypt, provides an interesting insight into the relative participation by stakeholders in university education in Morocco as invited by colleagues in the European Union to participate in discussions about how universities could better operate in that country. The parallel case of Egypt, and which I'll come back to in a second here, the stakeholders basically were not invited to the table at all in university reform. Now, as far as Egypt educational reforms, if reform is the right term to go, the regime there is trying to square the circles that Mullah Hicham pointed to. And the circles are control in the first instance. The regime is very frightened of youth. Secondly, it wants to reduce its expenditure on education. Middle East and North Africa is not really underspending on education in comparison to the rest of the world. It's misallocating those resources. And in the case of Egypt, there's a serious budget crunch, and so it's trying to reduce its expenditures, at least in proportion to other subjects, not the least of them being military expenditures. And then thirdly, the regime is trying to recruit loyalists. And so it has set up a series of schools, if these are called the reforms, in which it's trying to square the circle between these competing desires and at the same time appeasing public opinion, which is very upset about the quality and cost of education in the country. So the squaring the circle has taken a very authoritarian form, which is modeled on sort of a combination of Asian models and it seems apparent to me at least, and those who read the chapter can judge it for themselves, on Nazi Germany. That it almost looks like this is a dead copy of the old NASPO schools that trained the Hitler Jugend in some cases. So if that's reform, well, it's a rather funny use of the term. I won't speak about Lindsay's chapter other than to say that she addresses a really important question in Middle East, North Africa education, which is the impacts of inequality upon it, which are quite profound. I'll skip right to the very end of the volume, which is something that's unique insofar as I'm aware in treatments of education in the Middle East and North Africa. It's 2 comparative studies. One is of Latin America and the other is of East Asia. Marilee Grindle has done a fine job in trying to explicate how there's a little more wiggle room in Latin American educational reform by virtue of the political freedom, relative political freedoms in that part of the world. And Lisa Jones, in her chapter on East Asia, has pointed to several important aspects of that educational, of those systems, and why they are not replicated in the Middle East. And one of them, again, to parallel economic growth literature, is the flying goose model. That in East Asia, the Japanese flying goose model for economic growth was paralleled with a school system, which was widely copied throughout the rest of East Asia. But the bottom line of performance, in Elisa's view, is that it's tied to meritocratic recruitment. That unlike the patronage systems in the Middle East, North Africa, East Asia is based on meritocratic systems of recruitment in the civil service and elsewhere. The conclusion of the book is maybe not as negative as what Moulay and I have just been saying. It is to say that there's still wiggle room for reform within the existing order, marginal possibly, but it's still there. And it's driven in part by the similar phenomenon of the Arab Spring. That is, people are fed up with the quality of their lives and the services delivered to them. They have measures, and this is really important, they have measures of the poor quality of their own systems. And those are thanks to the World Bank and its Human Capital Index. They're thanks to UNDP and the Human Development Index. They're thanks to the educational specialists who have created the PISA, TIMSS, and other global scores. So you can look now in any part of the world and see how your educational system is performing. So that's driving it. Marissa, I'm afraid to confess that I haven't truly answered your question, but I did want to give an overview of the book to readers and its rather unique features, of which there are several, and not the least, I'll underscore this and conclude, that we're trying to compare Middle East and North Africa education to other parts of the world. And we think collectively then this will enable, hopefully, scholars who are inspired by the book to really drill down more specifically into the independent variables within limited access orders that are of particular importance for producing the negative educational outcomes that have been forthcoming. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I'm sure we will expand the discussion further. But it's good to know that there is a glimmer of hope, or like you said, some wiggle room for some reforms to be enacted within the current systems. Ishaq, I'm going to turn to you to delve into your chapter, which I found your study and findings fascinating, linking education and democracy. We've, in discussing democratization trends in the region, particularly since the Arab uprisings, many here in Washington in the think tank community delved to understand why these protests have erupted, and to better, I guess, assess people's directions and their values. Was it an indication that people wanted more democracy, or was it simply various triggers that, with all this pent-up frustration and anger about basically the regression of their public services, etc., that has led to that. So I think this will give you an opportunity to tell us, well, how have education systems actually impacted people's values or behavior, towards democracy and democratization in general.
Thank you, Marissa, for these impossible questions. It's good to be with you. It's a bit hard to follow after Moulay Hicham and Bob Springborg, but I'll try, especially by putting numbers to some of the issues they talked about. So let me start by summarizing a little bit the question I raised and my findings, and then I will try to end up trying to answer, Marissa, your questions on the Arab Spring and its aftermath. So, let me start by highlighting what my previous speakers have said, which is that much of the measures of the quality of education tend to be on skills for the market. You yourself noted that, reading, writing, math skills. We know that those are low in the region, but the goal of education, importantly, includes, like everywhere, the shaping of the minds, values such as national identity, and the relation of the individuals to politics and to religion and to the values of the states. And that's true everywhere. What I try to do in my chapters is to treat this issue quantitatively. It looks directly, I look directly at political values held by individuals, and I ask how much education emancipates politically in the Arab region. Does it instill progressive values, participation in the political process, activism, and the like, or instead does it promote conservative values, such as respect for authority or political quietism? And actually, these are things we can measure as much as we can actually measure the quality of education or the return of education, you know, how much more education increases income. So really, my work adds measures of these things, measures of how much education emancipates politically. I use for that global opinion polls, in this particular case, the World Value Survey, which include individual data from 90 countries and about 300,000 individuals. So this really allows us to make international comparison, you know, to ask, does education in the Arab world, in various countries of the region, emancipate as much as in other regions? And it allows us also to compare, you know, people with different levels of education among themselves within each countries. Now, the important result that I find is that education, and especially tertiary education in the Middle East, in the Arab countries, emancipates very little, if at all. Now, of course, the results vary by country, but they're very robust. In some countries, you actually find that education produces educated individuals that on average are more conservative politically than the less educated, which is quite extreme. Now, I argue in the chapter that this is not due to culture, to Arab culture, but really to the way in which the education system itself is organized. In fact, I find in another publication that this type of result tends to hold not just in the region, but in most autocracies around the world. More generally, it fits a pattern where democracies instill emancipative political values and autocracies conservative values. The education system is really a key ideological instrument for the state. And indeed, you know, most education systems are owned by the state and monopolized by the state. Now, there's a large literature there that looks at Europe, United States, and has shown convincingly, you know, years ago that education is actually a key instrument for political emancipation. Now, in contrast, you know, recent work from China has shown that education actually increases political conservatism, you know, very much like the results that I find in my chapter on the Arab world. Now, how does it do that? In my chapters, I don't focus on mechanisms, but several chapters in the book do that. I mean, these mechanisms include, for example, the selections of students into higher education, the selection of the type of students from background with values that are compatible with those of the regimes. I think the chapters by Adil Hamaiza and Andrew Leber on the selection and the management of students that go abroad in Algeria and in Saudi Arabia in chapter 8 does that very well. Another mechanism is the methods of teaching. You know, Mulay Hicham spoke of the curriculum, of the way of teaching. You yourself spoke of the rote teaching. Roel Mayer in chapter 3 looks at history books, actually, and how they convey, you know, particular values. They also do that by graduating only those supporting groups, you know, from supporting groups. Robert Springborg does that in chapter 5 by highlighting the selection into elite schools in Egypt. So really, to sum up, education in the Arab world instills low quality skills. It delivers low returns to education, right? I mean, much of the educated end up unemployed or working in the informal sector. It doesn't add a lot to income, largely because there are not many jobs out there. And it instills conservative political values, political and social values. Now, how do we make sense of these characteristics? You know, they seem deeply connected, actually, with the political economy of the region in the past 3 decades, especially after the structural adjustment programs of the 80s and 90s. Regimes were under pressure, and they selectively liberalized their markets, not their policies, not their polities, rather. This is my work on crony capitalism that seemed to have inspired Bob and Mulay. So really, this type of crony capitalism that arose, controlled capitalism, had little growth and therefore little supply of good jobs. And this led to low return to education, but also low social demand or low pressure by firms for the education system to improve its quality. Now, at the same time, under pressure by rising cohorts of angry youth, most countries massively expanded their university enrollments, even when no good jobs were available. They really did that to socialize their youth. Now, this came at the expense of a deteriorating quality of the whole system, given the shrinking budgets, as Bob has suggested. But instead of pushing values connected to Arab nationalism as post-independence system did, they actually pushed religious conservative values of obedience to the leader, of stability, and not values of voice or analytical skills, as you would expect in these circumstances. So the results were not only low monetary return to skills, to repeat, but also low qualities and low emancipative content. Now, in contrast, chapters in the book suggest that in Latin America, the system produced medium skills quality and high emancipative content. This is the chapter by Mary Lee Grindle. And in Asia, the opposite, high skill contents, but conservative values. Now, all these outcomes were heavily dependent on these political contexts. So let me perhaps conclude with two thoughts to come, Melissa, to your first question. This kind of low mix, low quality and low emancipative return colored the uprising and their aftermath as well. If I was to speculate a little bit, the Arab Spring was very much driven by youth with grievances related to low returns to education, no jobs in spite of having gotten an education. But at the same time, their low aptitudes to political organization have weakened their ability to actually affect political change, at least so far. Now, the second big conclusion, I think, from looking at the problem from this perspective is that political efforts are needed to change the education system itself. We speak a lot when we focus on quality, on accountability mechanisms at the school level, led by parents' associations that would put pressure, for example, on teachers to be there. This is the system hailed by the World Bank of social accountability. But when we look at education as focusing on social and political values, this is not enough. Education becomes really the core battlefield for political progress towards more liberty and more freedom. So back to you.
Thank you very, very much, Ishaq. I found the reference to studies on China also fascinating, with sort of this nexus between education and emancipative values and the conservative element, particularly about whether those systems are actively brainwashing, or are they actually just providing a narrative and then people just use that narrative and act it out. I found that to be quite fascinating. And as we move forward, we're now like 10 years into the Arab uprisings, and given the impact of COVID-19 on the economy, we're likely to see a lot more protests. So it'll be interesting to see sort of, the second or third wave, whether it will look different than the first wave, given the lack of, as you said, skills in political organizing and mobilizing. So very timely discussion. So I'm going to turn to you, Lindsay. Your chapter zooms into Tunisia and looks at the impact of inequality. So what have you found there in terms of the impact of inequality on education outcomes?
Thank you, Marissa. Can everyone see my slides? Yes. All right. Yes. Thank you. The title of my chapter is Poverty, Inequality, and Corruption Explaining Variation in Educational Quality in Tunisia. And to return to the puzzle of the book, the overarching puzzle of the book is this. Despite substantial spending on education and support for reform, the quality of education in most Arab countries is low. And yet Tunisia, I think we assume, is a success story in terms of education. It has very high enrollment levels and literacy levels. And this is especially true among women and girls. And this has been cited as a factor supporting the Arab Spring in Tunisia. And Tunisia has a centrally organized and funded education system. And thus, in principle, students might also encounter an equitable system. Yet, as I discussed in my chapter, quality and transparency are substantial challenges. I show how and why this is the case, and I suggest that the primary challenge in Tunisia is not gender inequality when it comes to educational quality, but rather socioeconomic status. And so I want to turn our lens away from looking at gender inequality, which I think is a very important lens to engage, especially when it comes to the job market, but have us turn to more towards the impact of socioeconomic inequality and how that structures the quality of education that students encounter. The tool that I use in this chapter is the Local Governance Performance Index, which is a large survey that was conducted by the Governance and Local Development, the Program on Governance and Local Development. I conducted this survey in collaboration with Ellen Last, Pierre Landry, and Dafra Malouche, and there's a website where you can read more about the LGPI survey. In this survey, about 3,600 Tunisians living in 18 municipalities, which are nested within 6 governorates, were asked a variety of questions about their governance and their social services, including education. And because we use large samples in each of the 18 municipalities of 200 citizens or more, we can interrogate why the quality of schools and the need to make informal payments, i.e. bribes, varies both across students as well as across municipalities. The education system in Tunisia, I find, is characterized by 2 features: centralization and weak rule of law. Students prepare for 2 major exams, including the BAC, and these exams determine whether they will be able to continue their education and in what fields. The initial report that the Program on Governance and Local Development produced on this survey found that families spend more on tutoring and other services than the entire state budget in Tunisia for education. And this has a couple of effects. One, it leads wealthier families to be able to obtain extra services to support their students in being successful in the BAC. But it also fosters the opportunity among educators for rent seeking and to seek bribes or corruption at various points within the educational system, because the BAC is such an important moment for students and a gateway really to social mobility in Tunisia. So this is where the notion of the limited access order comes in. The BAC is very, very important. Families spend a great deal of money to try to enable their children to do better, and this creates also rent-seeking opportunities in the context of weak rule of law. So I first look at school quality. In this survey, the respondents were asked about their children, questions about the quality of the school, and here we can see that the question that asked whether the schools had clean toilets, only 38% of respondents stated that their child's school had clean toilets. Almost 80% stated that the teachers were usually at school, so about 22% noted problems with teacher absenteeism, but most of the respondents said that their children were at least in classes with fewer than 40 students. When we created a scale of school quality, here we can see that there's great variation across the municipalities in terms of quality. The highest quality was in Jebel Jaloud municipality in Tunis, and yet another municipality in Tunis, Sidi Khadra, actually had kind of middle of the road school quality. One of the most developed municipalities in the survey, in terms of having most of the houses with water hookup, had high quality schooling. But also Silianaville, which is actually the least developed municipality in the survey, also had high quality education relative to the other municipalities. So there's a lot of variation across municipalities that's only partially captured by historical factors related to economic development. So there must also be some institutional factors as well. In terms of transparency, we found that 7% nationally had during the last year made an informal payment related to the child's education. Yet it was as high as 31.5% in one of the municipalities in Monastir. And yet you can also see in this figure that 5 or 6 municipalities had very low, if any, reported bribe paying. So to conclude, by using multivariate analysis, I found there were 2 major findings that came out of that analysis. The first is that poorer households and those living in less affluent regions enjoy lower quality schools in Tunisia. And it's this socioeconomic inequality that is more striking in the data than gender inequality. Second, transparency is a significant problem with, as I said, 7% of families nationwide reporting having paid a bribe in the previous year. But these bribes were disproportionately being paid in rural areas. And finally, there's unexplained variation across districts. The LGPI is one type of tool that can help us develop solutions for trying to understand and improve educational quality. A theme that runs through the book is this notion that it's relatively easy to expand enrollment in schools, but to tackle problems of educational quality and transparency is much more difficult. 3 policy implications that one might draw from this chapter are the following. First, that reforms should strengthen the rule of law in order to improve the educational system. Second, it's necessary to develop standards of accountability for educators, and this might involve providing monetary or other resource incentives to schools that make improvements in quality, such as teacher attendance. This might also include engaging local bureaucrats, following from Marilee Grindel's conclusions in her chapter about Latin America, engaging local bureaucrats and educators in developing the kinds of reforms that they want to see in their schools. And finally, development organizations must invest more in lower socioeconomic regions and neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Those are really interesting findings on Tunisia. I think 2 very sort of quick reactions, and I hope we get into the discussion on those. With regards to your findings, the first about families having to spend more on tutoring because of this sort of gap. I found a sort of families in Jordan in the private school system complaining of the same phenomenon. So that would be, obviously this is anecdotal, it's not a study, but it would be interesting to sort of compare those 2 case studies. And finally, with regards to the policy implication on transparency and providing incentives, again, sort of drawing from my knowledge of Jordan, there was an attempt, I think, by the government to introduce basically teachers' assessments in order to improve the quality of education and link promotions and salary increases to those assessments. And there was huge pushback from the Teachers Association, and it erupted into basically demonstrations by the Teachers Professional Association. So it'll be interesting to also at some point discuss, and I know Tunisia has a very strong union culture. So it would be interesting to sort of also better understand whether the government moves forward with some of these reforms, how or what kind of pushback we will be seeing. But of course, all big questions and fascinating research. And now we'll turn to Safa, who, as Robert mentioned, is an expert on education and led the latest study on education in the region at the World Bank. Safa, I'm going to invite you to comment on the book, and I believe that all panelists will be hearing your commentary for the first time. So please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. And I want to actually thank the organizers, the Wilson Center, and the authors for inviting me to comment on the book, and for their trust in not asking me to send my comments in advance. So it's the first time that they hear my comments. Look, I can't claim I'm an expert on education, but I was trained as an economist. But I actually saw the role of education in the development of countries, especially countries in the region and my own country. And I just saw that it was really a fundamental area that explains the development of nations around the world. And that's how I got into this sector. Now, thanks to Robert for his words about the flagship report we did a couple of years ago. And that stemmed out of a similar question that this book tried to address, is why is education quality so low? And why is it not meeting the expectations and aspirations of citizens in the Arab world or in the Middle East and North Africa? And I felt that a lot of our analysis and diagnosis is technical. And that's where we have the data and we could actually say something. It's much harder to try to understand the political economy aspects. And when I tried to look for material and literature within this realm, I couldn't find much. So in this sense, this book is really a great addition in trying to put some of these questions there, in trying to reflect a little bit on the political economy aspects, because there isn't much on the political economy of education. There's a lot on political economy of development in the region, but not, not on education. So I think this is great. I'm going to comment on a number of things. One, I'd like to comment on the conceptual framework, because this is something I wasn't aware of, even though it was something introduced in 2007 by some colleagues at the World Bank, this limited access order approach. And I felt the book tries to have it throughout the different chapters, speaking to it, but I didn't feel it was explained sufficiently up front. So I went to the paper to read it and try to understand it a little bit. And so I just wanted to comment on that. And then I'll give a few comments around the arguments and analyses from the different chapters. I'm not going to go chapter by chapter, but just some points that came out that I would like to speak to. And then finally, I wanted to ask questions, and I will have questions throughout, but in terms of what I thought was missing in the book, because a lot of the authors talk about further research that can be done, which I think is great. And I want to also point out to some things that I would have liked to see that could possibly be a volume 2 of this book. So just coming to the conceptual framework and the limited access order concept, which was developed. And it was developed more in the context of development to take a different non-technical look at development and violence. And the argument that Douglas North and his colleagues make is that the traditional way of trying to present tools and concepts from developed countries to developing countries may not really work. And so basically, they came up with a concept that looks at certain countries that have limited access order, which means elites use rents to maintain order and to build the social order together. And in such countries, they have social, economic, and political systems based on limited entry and rent creation, quote, or end of quote. So they see that the political system manipulates the economy to generate rents that bind the interest of economic actors to support the current political system. This is opposed as to the open access order that's characterized by access and by competition, which we see in more developed countries. So within this conceptual framework, the authors argue that simply put, that the obstacle to education reform in Arab countries is that authoritarian governments are intentionally keeping the quality of education low because that serves their purposes. And they pay rents to maintain that status quo. So I think the concept is interesting. I'm just not sure if it captures the complexity of the education process sufficiently. As we've written in the World Bank report on expectations and aspirations, the education process is really a complex set of factors and actors that interact to produce education outcomes. And these operate at so many different levels among so many different people that if we single out just the government paying out rents to control education and that the status of education is deliberate, I think we miss a lot of the nuances. So I wasn't sure if this is, and I am curious to hear from the authors why they chose this conceptual framework as opposed to others. So one of the things that North and his colleagues speak about is that context really matters. And it's a point that we also make in our report, that context matters. And in this sense, I think when we look at education reforms in countries in the Arab world or elsewhere, to me, the issue is not so much, I mean, I don't know, I don't have data to talk about the intentions of rulers, but what I see from the evidence is it's how the reforms are designed, how they're introduced, how they're approved, how they're implemented. All of that creates a different constraint, right? We also looked at one of the key aspects of the report that I feel the book touches upon in the different factors is what we refer to as tensions, right? There's tensions between traditional ways of thinking on modernity. And Ishaq in his chapter talks about conservatism. It's about control and autonomy. And the chapter on universities in Morocco and Egypt talks about that, right? We talk about the whole idea of degrees or credentials versus skills, right? So these tensions for me, and the fourth set of tensions is on discipline versus inquiry. And also Ishaq talks about that really what's holding back the returns to education, the political social returns, is the fact that the curriculum and the quality of education, what students are taught, doesn't make them more democratic in their thinking. And so I think a lot of that is in the book. It doesn't come out as strongly as the intentions of the rulers. So just again, as I said, it'd be really interesting to think about why, or to learn why the authors picked this framework. As I'm reading, I thought of two potential frameworks. One is that of the social contract, of Hobbes' social contract, and maybe revisiting the social contract, which was in existence for decades in these Arab countries, where you provide certain services, free education, free health. In return, citizens are appeased and don't question. And a lot of work has been done in terms of revisiting the social contract in the Middle East and North Africa after the Arab Spring, maybe not so much in education. Another approach that I thought about reading through this, especially talking about the intentions of rulers, was Foucault's will to truth. As I'm reading, I kept thinking of, well, what's the will to truth? Now, it's very hard to get at that with data and with measurement, but it's an interesting concept because he talks about the discourse and the hegemony of discourses. And I think that fits also very well within education, because discussions around curriculum, discussions about language of instruction, discussions about decentralization, who really has power in terms of the discourse around these discussions as they are ongoing in the region. Then, excuse me. So just coming to the chapter, to Hicham chapter, which I thought was really fascinating, the way he used the data to look at the interlinks between education and democracy. And I think that the question of, he doesn't really link it to this limited access order, but I think it shows sort of the transition of what countries can do to move from limited access to more open access. And he presents sort of in his conclusions, things like a curriculum that's more inquiry-based as ways of making sure that the returns to the social political returns are higher. I think the question of culture or politics is important. Now, Ishaq argues that it's not cultural specificities of the region, but socio-political conservatism related to the dominant religion. Jones, at the same time, talks about the question of culture and politics on the chapter on lessons from East Asia. And so East Asian countries are at the top of education systems around the world in terms of learning outcomes, but they're also characterized by socio-political conservatism. And so the question here for me is, how is it that those countries manage to have education systems to produce top students, whereas Arab countries did not succeed, given that both have a very strong socio-political conservatism? I just on the point on conservatism, which Ishaq also says is linked to the dominant religion. While probably was 2010, 2011, we did a study on youth in Egypt. And what was interesting there was the conservatism among youth was irrespective of religion. Both Muslims and Christians had extremely conservative views around gender, around a lot of actually aspects. And so I just wanted to point that out, that I think the conservatism goes across religions in the region. Now, as I mentioned, the emancipative power of education that Ishaq pointed to around inquiry-based learning, around pedagogy. And I thought the chapter on how citizenship is portrayed in textbooks. And this is something beyond the Arab world. This is around all over the world. Like, whose story is it? When people say his story, history, I always ask whose story. And that's been manipulated. That's in the US, that's in Europe, that's everywhere, right? And it comes back to this question of the will to truth of Foucault. It's like, what is it that governments are trying to achieve in terms of removing certain events from history textbooks, emphasizing others. Recently, a huge debate erupted in Sudan because the director of curriculum basically removed critical parts within 6th grade curriculum and added a picture of Michelangelo on the creation of Adam. And it just completely led to riots. And I think this speaks to what I said about how do you introduce reforms. And I think in Jordan, you would probably remember when pictures of women without a veil were introduced in textbooks, everybody was out on the street. And so I think these are important points to capture, but the question becomes, how do you introduce those? When do you introduce them? How do you involve all the relevant parties, whether they're religious leaders, civil society leaders, parents? Because I believe that it's not just the government that is pushing this, but the conservatism actually comes from the public as well. And if we want to see any reforms or any change, the public does need to be included. And these, I think, are some of the concluding remarks of the book by the editors, that all stakeholders need to be involved in this process, which I fully agree with. Now, I just want to dedicate my last few points to the chapter on Egypt, Sisi's Egypt and the reform. And, you know, when I accepted to speak and comment on the book, I wasn't aware of this chapter. The reforms in Egypt, I've been very, very close to these reforms in Egypt. In fact, I was the manager for the Middle East and North Africa when those reforms were being discussed, not even introduced. So the Education 2.0 that Minister Tariq Shawki had. And I tend to disagree with Robert on the analysis of that chapter. In fact, I think the reforms in Egypt are the model that other countries should look at. It follows a lot of what the technical analysis of the best practices we've seen around countries. It is trying to transform the education system rather than tweak it from different aspects, because that doesn't work. It's actually taking head on the elephant in the room, which is the Thanawiyya Amma, which has actually changed the culture around Egypt, which has created this tutoring cartel where everybody basically from the day they're born is trained for the Thanawiyya Amma, because it determines where they end up going in university. And by taking the bull by the horn and saying there will be no Thanawiyya Amma was huge. And I think the role of the president was supporting the Education 2.0 because the public was outraged. Now you have youth who are excited because they're going to be learning through tablets, who see a change from what they're used to, but you have parents. So I recall someone sending a text message to the minister, a mother, saying, I don't care if my son learns. All I want him is to get into university, right? And so changing that mindset, changing those norms is very difficult, and they cannot happen without political commitment and political leadership. So regardless of what type of regime exists in any country, Egypt or others, what is important is having the leadership and the commitment to see these reforms forward. And what I've seen in Egypt is exactly that. Now, I was there when the minister had to go and explain to the president what his vision was. So when I say I disagree with the analysis, it's not that the government wants to impose control and is using the reform to do that. Rather, what I'm seeing is they're embarking on a huge transformation of the system, which is shaking the social fabric that people have been used to for decades. And the leadership and commitment from the government actually helped. We're seeing positive signs so far. It is a program that's supported by the World Bank, but it's also supported by many other countries. So it's not just a World Bank finance project. So my final question is, the authors say this is not intended to provide analysis. This is not intended to provide, I actually highlighted the exact words, which I thought was good. This is observations, predictions, assumptions, not firmly empirically grounded. The intention is not to test hypotheses, but to speculate, not a definitive investigation of causes and consequences. For me, that, I think they missed the opportunity. I think some, like the Tunisia chapter, for example, did use a lot of the data to investigate the poverty aspects and their impact on the quality of education. But others could have gone deeper because they asked the right questions, but then they say, well, more research is needed to respond to these questions. So I think for a volume 2 of this work, more analytics, more data, I think would be, it's harder, but I think would be very, very useful. So thank you again very much for allowing me to comment. And I'm sorry if I spoke a little bit over my time.
Thank you so much, Safa. I'm sure you gave the panelists lots to unpack. So I'm just going to give an opportunity to our editors and authors to respond, perhaps to some of your questions, because we also have questions, quite a few of them actually from the audience, and we're running out of time. Mullah Hicham, would you like to jump in, and then perhaps we'll go to Bob, Ishaq, and Lindsay.
Yes, very quickly. Thank you for that wonderful critique. We don't claim at any moment in this book that this is the overall and this is the last word on this topic. This is a first effort, and as a first effort, it can only be partial, and it can, though rigorous and in all modesty rich, it's only scratching the surface. There's much more to look at. Very quickly, I'm going to address, I think, two issues, so I'll let my colleagues address the rest. On the issue of Asia versus MENA, it brings us to the paradigm and to the source of this kind of thinking, which Ishaq Diwan scoped out very well. Why is it that in MENA, in Asia, even if you have authoritarian regimes, you have less of the nepotism than in MENA, even if both, on Freedom House scales, regimes and regime types would have similar grades or similar restrained spaces of contestation. And I suppose the idea is the same, where you have some form of opposition, some form of countervailing message, it will keep your regime in check. South Korea was not operating in an open environment. It was financed essentially by the West and the United States, and it had to be very careful. It was in a very difficult environment in the Cold War. Likewise in Taiwan, where it had the Chinese neighbor, and so these regimes were autocratic, but they could not veer into nepotism, which would have spelled their end. In that sense, that has that kind of feature. These kind of features are not ubiquitous. They will spill into other fields, namely education, and namely we see the flying goose model because of that. So I think in the next book we could talk about simulations, but regime features and their effects on the economy and political economy will, I think, find their translation and will find their reflection in the educational systems. Regarding the fact that there are other drivers here, not only states, and you evoke Morocco and Egypt. I will I will just indicate that in the 1980s, philosophy and political science were basically disciplines that were outlawed from the curriculum in university in Morocco. I'm not an education specialist. I don't know how that came about, whether by decree or by parliamentary decision or whatever, but I know that large disciplines invoking critical thought have been essentially scrapped out of curriculum. Having said that, in the past 20 years, there's another actor in the field, and it's not just the executive, but it is these syndicates that have to do with education. Why? Because education has been such an important field in which the social contract was being, if you will, or a new social contract, knew all these gestations, that these syndicates have been very powerful. And with syndicates, there have been other political economies created, the political economies of textbook creations, of employment, of perks to get jobs. And yes, the leveling field is not all tilts all in regimes, but there are other players, and I have to look at the personal chapters again to see if that has been evoked. Very quickly, one last thing. A closed or limited access order does not mean that it's an either-or situation. You can have a closed limited access order, and it can open up in degrees. A system is either democratic or it's not, but it can be partially free, and that space of freedom can open up. It is not to be eliminated or to be completely discarded, that if these regimes following another cycle of eruption, that in fact they open up to a certain degree where certain things on the agenda can become less of a limited access or less of a monopoly in the state and become more consensual. So again, it's an either or situation in terms of limited access orders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Robert, would you like to comment as well?
Thanks, Marissa. Thank you, Safa, very much for your very useful overview and for your comments on my chapter 2. I'll just address 2 of your points. The first is why limited access orders? What was the appeal of that particular notion? And I guess we can give credit to Ishak in this regard, because when applied to economic growth, very convincing, and it was able to be quite clearly, empirically demonstrated what these negative impacts are. So by analogy, one wanted to follow up on that. That's the sort of intellectual, and in fact, I've just published a book using limited access orders to explain more about state capacities in general. In this book, we didn't want to dig into the concept of limited access orders. We simply wanted to use it at a relatively superficial level. So you're right to raise the question about it. But the other reason of its appeal was, I think it had resonance with those of us who worked in the Middle East, especially in development projects, as you have yourself, and to run up against the obstacles of a political nature, of the authority required, of the permissions, of the fear of stakeholders, of inciting the wrath of authorities. And so hanging over, and I worked for several years in Egypt in association with USAID, just the impossibility of gaining any freedom for stakeholders to innovate at the local level, and certainly at the higher level, said to someone, well, wait a minute here. It's not that these people are not aware of the need for their views to be taken account of. It's they're frightened they're not allowed to be. So the limited access order had real appeal just at the sort of gut level after one has experienced it. As for Egypt, look, I think the fundamental difference is this, that the World Bank and other organizations that know an awful lot about education and reform, and more than those of us collectively in this book know, is that it's decentralization of control and the removal of control and the participation of stakeholders as decision makers that are two key and maybe the most key elements to successful reform. In the case of Egypt, and another argument about reform is the top-down model, which is the Egyptian model, namely that there are obstacles to reform of a variety of sorts. Moulay has just mentioned the syndicates in Morocco. There are teachers' unions in Egypt. They are, and as Marilee Grindle has argued convincingly in Latin America, generally obstacles to change. So you can say, well, look, if you want to do reform, it really does have to be dictated from the top. The Thanawiya Amma has been the bane of Egypt's it's a Scottish idea, in fact, interestingly enough, taken to Egypt, and the bane of higher education, of secondary education in Egypt for years and years. But to follow the advice of the education experts and to rely upon top-down reforms is to invite, it seems to me, very serious side effect problems. And in the case of Egypt at present, the side effect problem are the other agendas the regime has. And those agendas are controlling youth. They're reducing expenditure proportionally on public education. They are recruiting an elite group of young people who are in the mold very much of the Hitler Jugend. They have been recruited into the security services, which are playing an ever-increasing role in education. And so even if you're correct in saying, well, these reforms will have good effects, there are side effects for the political economic order and ultimately for education, I think will be extremely negative. So I would prefer the more decentralized model of greater autonomy on the part of the components of the educational system, coupled with the freedom of stakeholders to express their points of view. So thank you, Safa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robert. Ishaq?
Yeah, thank you, Safa. These were very interesting remarks you've done. I think you're right. This research needs to be pushed. And this is the beginning. Also, Hicham says that, but I think it's a strong beginning. I mean, as you said, ideology is everywhere. It's in the West, it's in the East, and education is the key instrument for disciplining, for, you referred to Foucault, one can go to Bourdieu, you know, the hegemonic narrative of self-preservation. And as Hicham said in Morocco, I mean, education is always on the agenda. It's the same in France. Anything that happens gets reflected in the debate on education. How do we format our children to deal with this or that? So I think to really put that on the table is super important. And yes, it is deliberate. It's deliberate by the system. The system forces that. And so if you want to change the system, you got to change that. You got to fight in the education domain in order to change society. So you say, for example, that, you know, the Egyptian society refuses things. There are norms, but these norms are manufactured. I mean, the reason society became much more religious over time was a political decision to move away from communist opposition and to empower religious authorities. There is a good literature in the Middle East that shows that this is an old trick. It's not something new. And so this can be endogenized as well. Now, it's, you know, one interesting result in my work is that actually the non-educated have similar values across countries. It's really education that makes the difference in terms of emancipation or not politically. It's the key instrument, actually. It's not really in culture. And I mean, Marisa was asking, is this really indoctrination in the sense of you know, changing the mind? And you know, it's hard to tell that in a study of the regions, since countries resemble each other. But I have another study that compares country across the world, and that has a pretty strong identification strategy. And basically, I look at countries that were autocratic and become democratic. There are about 35 of them. And you look at people educated under autocracy and compare them to those educated in democracy, and they all live under the same circumstances, and you do find this difference in values. Now, what is it I wanted to say? So the difference is mostly due to education. Now, in terms, and religion was largely instrumentalized here. In terms of the model, I mean, it's when we talk about chronism, the LOA model made a lot of sense because it kind of restricts the equilibrium concept to one of equilibrating power and the economy. And here we've added actually ideas, ideology. So I think it gets broader than LOAs in a way towards Michael Mann's idea of several domains, including ideas and military. And the book actually touches into that. Robert speaks of despotic versus infrastructural power and uses that also as a concept. So I would agree we need to broaden, but it's a good start. And let me, a small criticism to the World Bank, if I may. Social contract is not a theory. It's just, you cannot say here's a social contract, let's change it. We need to understand what shapes a social contract in equilibrium. So we need to go one step higher, I think, in terms of intellectual contract, intellectual constructs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ishaq. Lindsay, and then we'll turn to a few questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Safa and Marisa, for sharing your, your ideas about the book and also your observations from growing up in Jordan. I think this issue of unions and stakeholders is a very important one. And I think if ever there is a sector where decentralization is very important and empowering parents and local educators and local government to think about what the issues are in their own schools, I think this is actually the sector where it's most important. I believe Marilee Grindle writes a little bit about that in her chapter and the importance in Latin America of empowering local bureaucracy to think through the issues. And so I think that really is very important. But with that, I think I'd love to hear some more questions from the audience.
Great, thank you so much, Lindsay. We have a few of them, so I'm just going to try to sort of pack them up a little bit. So one from Anissa Bouziane, a professor and writer from Morocco. Does the book offer actionable strategies for growing critical thinking in classrooms, both as part of civics curricula as well as within more broad-based liberal arts approaches? Who would like to go for that? Just jump in. Hicham or maybe
I really don't think we go into exact pedagogic curricula and how these have contributed to shortcomings. I think we rather talk, or the chapter on Morocco talks about the overarching political architecture and the preponderant role of political control over curriculum since independence. And I would think that the book stays at that level. Bob, you want to say something more about it?
Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
I agree. It's not a recipe book for how to do reform. The conclusion takes up the issue of reform and tries to sort of specify what the channels of reform might be. And so by implication, if you're interested in reform, you can think about how relevant those channels are in, say, Morocco or in other countries, and what one might do to pursue reform through those channels. But to get down to the specifics, as Millie just said, about pedagogical reforms in the classroom and so on, no, we don't go there. But Safa's, of which he served the principal author of Expectations and Aspirations, there you would find that.
Thank you. Next question is from William Lawrence, professor of political science at American University here in Washington. If the reason for political conservatism is not driven by culture, why is the Tunisian education system still so conservative?
Well, it was put together by Ben Ali. I mean, Ben Ali raised the level of university attendance from something like 8-9% to 30% of the kids at the time where there were no jobs. It was clearly driven by political motives to get the kids busy. And together with that went the formation of an education system to construct the mind in a particular way. This is not strange idea at all. There were mass education campaigns since the 60s, and they were used for ideological reasons very openly. So the system has been top down and has been about pushing down ideas for a long time. Let me add, there's a very well-known result in what's called progressive education, which is that, unless in your formative age you participate in some community practice, you are unlikely to be involved in politics, in demonstration. You're unlikely to vote for the rest of your life. So this is not formatting in a strange way. It's actually developing democratic skills. So, a minimum test we should put is to not just ask for, quality education in the sense of computers and skills, but also ask minimum tests, community participation, have the kids participate to work together on something. And that never happens when, it's all about rote learning and repeating what the teacher says and not getting involved actually in community affairs.
Thank you very much, Ishaq. Next question is from Manuel Lagendorf, who's an independent researcher. Do you overall view the emergence of ed tech as a positive development for educational standards in the MENA region? And how can ed tech be used in the current situation to foster critical thinking and help students gain the skills they need for the region's digital transformation? Who would like to jump in to answer that?
I mean, I think it's important, but I think it cannot substitute for the real in-person teaching. But I do think that, with the rise of pandemics and the coronavirus, yes, I think that governments and that private players should have this virtual learning bolstered. But at the end of the day, let's be careful with quick fixes. I mean, it reminds me of privatization of education. It reminds me of saying, of the claim that, well, the state can't do everything, and if the state can't do everything, then we will have, private education fill in the gap. And that has created a bifurcated system, in which at the end of the day, those that have are in a better off situation than those that don't have, and it's further deepened the inequality. So my answer would be qualified by I think by these caveats.
Thank you.
Marissa, can I come in?
Yeah, yes, of course, Afa, go ahead.
Very quickly. No, I actually believe EdTech is definitely important. I agree with Hicham that it needs to be qualified. The evidence shows that teachers need to know how to use technology if we want students to learn using technology. Without that, it hasn't worked. And so teachers should primarily know how to use it. It should be used as a tool to facilitate learning rather than an end in itself by distributing tablets to students. And I think there's an important role for technology in accountability, in monitoring, in improving the management system, especially in decentralized settings, rather than having to go school by school and collecting the data by hand, where there are errors. If you have technology that becomes much more efficient and much more accurate. And finally, in actually very poor and remote settings, we found that teachers who are not well trained, you can give them scripted lessons using, tablets or whatever, and that had a very positive impact on learning for students. So there are multiple uses for EdTech that I think could be explored in the region. Thanks.
Thank you. And one last question before we go to sort of concluding remarks from David Rabinowitz. In recent years, a majority of university students in Saudi Arabia, including in STEM fields, are women. What jobs and careers would be available to these graduates in the Arab world? Again, anyone who wants to jump in, please go ahead.
Thank you for that comment. I would imagine many people are familiar with the idea of the reverse gender gap in the MENA, meaning that in most countries and in most sub-regions within countries, there are more girls and women enrolled than men. And I think, you see reforms really throughout the region, even in the most conservative countries, in terms of women's access to the labor market. Of course, there are inequalities in terms of wages. There are, these concerns as well. But the education sector is one of the areas where we see some very, very positive developments in terms of gender equality.
Thank you, Lindsay.
I would add very quickly to that, let's be gender blind for a second and see that the problem with these Gulf education systems, in that they are part and parcel of a larger contract of benefits from birth to death, and they in themselves foster a kind of dependency that, if you look at statistically, fosters and encourages less performance at the secondary level and the university level. So precisely by having certain guarantees handed out to you, they are affecting the performance of the education system, regardless of gender. So I just wanted to compliment Lindsay's remark.
Thank you.
And Ruth, if I could just add a comment,
yes.
That there's a curious paradox that as the feminization of education has proceeded virtually throughout the Arab world, so has there been a declining proportion of women in Arab labor forces. So this is a profound paradox. And there are two possible answers. One is discrimination, that women are being forced out. Public sectors are declining where they were concentrated. But another answer is provided by some of the work that Raghi Assad and his colleagues did in Egypt, taking a look at women's aspirations and what impact education had on their aspirations. And in a nutshell, and this greatly over-abbreviates much more complex findings, it was that marriage prospects were significantly heightened by education, and that this played a very significant role in women seeking education as opposed to employment. And so there was, quote, a social dimension to this that I guess hasn't been adequately factored into trying to resolve the dilemma of increasing education of women and decreasing, relatively speaking, proportion in the labor forces.
Yeah, that is the so-called the education system preparing women for the marriage market rather than the labor market, which has been a topic of discussion amongst women's groups in across the region, actually. But thank you for that addition. I'd like to ask each one of you to sort of give a concluding remark to help us sort of push this discussion a little bit forward. If there's one thought you want to leave us with today that would help us move this discussion forward, particularly in the region, what would that thought be? And I'm gonna point to Mullah Hicham to kick us off.
I've been intrigued by Safa's critique and yours as well. Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? And talking and evoking an idea in the conclusion, there is a wiggling room for these educations, because regimes and everybody realize that this is an unsustainable situation. And regimes do not only have the I don't know if it's positive or negative, but their problem is that they have like in rational choice, rational thought, a collective action problem. But the collective action problem is with themselves, not with a second party. So they have a commitment problem. On the one hand, they want their systems to be performing, and they want their systems to adapt to the requirements of and the exigencies of the labor market for their economies, because it would alleviate a lot of the socioeconomic problem and prop up their structures and their states. But at the same time, they cannot overcome this addiction for control. So the question leaves us, is this, and we ought to think about it, is this an easier problematic or a more difficult problematic to overcome within the rational choice paradigm?
Thank you. Robert, and keep it at 1 minute, please.
Well, there's a trade-off between control and freedom. And I think the problem in the Arab world is there's too much control and too little freedom. And just very quickly, by way of an example, the private Lebanese educational sector comprises 70% of the students in that country. The private educational Lebanese system has produced a really high quality labor force. And it is operated autonomously. I've dealt with the Ministry of Education there. That educational system is operated virtually completely autonomously of government. And frankly, I think it's probably about the best in the Arab world. So there is evidence to suggest that, you know, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Don't try the reform from the top down. Try to reduce the amount of control and stimulate thinking from the bottom up to improve education in the Arab world.
Thank you. Ishaq?
30 seconds. I'd say focus on both skills and values conveyed by the education system. And this really doesn't happen. In analysis, World Bank, domestic, Carnegie, and in public debates. And what I mean by value is not just political values that I discussed today, but more broadly, social values, patriarchal values, respect for differences. These are taught in school, actually. And we should measure to what extent the education system promotes them, and we should have debates on whether it should promote them or not.
Thank you, Ishaq. Lindsay?
I would say focus on rule of law and transparency, and to follow up on Ikshak's point about values, is to think about what students are learning in school. Of course, they're learning skills, but are they also learning that in order to succeed, it might be necessary to make an informal payment, it might be necessary to use WASTA, or these types of things. So focus on the institution and the values that students are learning.
Thank you, Lindsay. And Safa, last word.
That's a difficult one. Basically, I believe education is everyone's business. And we need to see how we can empower people to play an important role, as it is for values, it is for the development of countries. And so accountability, roles, responsibilities become very important. I also believe that it's important to work within the constraints that exist. We can't say the regime is non-democratic and that's it. We have to work with what we've got to focus on making the most for the children in these countries. Thank you again very much.
Thank you. And that's, I guess, the wiggle room that Robert had referred to in the beginning. So I just want to quickly thank all the panelists for a very enriching discussion that I've thoroughly enjoyed moderating. I've learned so much from all of you and from the various chapters I read, and I encourage everyone in the audience to pick up the book and read it. So thank you so much once again for being with us today. And we will continue this discussion as we move forward with various events at the Wilson Center. Thank you very much.